please, I say, and you repeat. And after this is what are called the 5. I first will say the mantras, then I will explain. Om, Om, Sadyo Jatam, Sadyo Jatam, Prapadyami, Prapadyami, Sadyo Jataya, Venamo Namaha, Sadyo Jataya, Venamo Namaha, Bhave, 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 Nati Bhave, Nati Bhave, Bhavasvamam, Bhavasvamam, Bhavudbhavaya Namaha, Bhavudbhavaya Namaha, Vamadevaya Namo, Vamadevaya Namo, Jeshtaya Nama, Jeshtaya Nama, Shrestaya Namo, Shrestaya Namo, Rudraya Nama, Rudraya Nama, Kalaya Nama, Kalaya Nama, Kalavikaranaya Namo, Kalavikaranaya Namo, Balaya Namo, Balaya Namo, Balavikaranaya Namo, Balavikaranaya Namo, Balapramatanaya Nama, Balapramatanaya Nama, Sarvabhuta Damanaya Namo, Sarvabhuta Damanaya Namo, Manunmanaya Namaha, Manunmanaya Namaha, Agorebhyo, Agorebhyo, Tagorebhyo, Tagorebhyo, Gora Goratarebhya, Gora Goratarebhya, Sarvata, Sarvata, Sarva Sarvebhyo, Sarvata, Sarva Sarvebhyo, Namaste Rudra Rupebhya, Namaste Rudra Rupebhya, Tat Purushaya Vidmahe, Tat Purushaya Vidmahe, Mahadevaya Dhimahi, Mahadevaya Dhimahi, Tanno Rudra, Rudra Prachodayat, Prachodayat, Ishanas Sarva Vidyanam, Ishana Sarva Vidyanam, Ishvara Sarva Bhutanam, Ishvara Sarva Bhutanam, Brahmadipatir, Brahmadipatir, Brahmanodipatir, Brahmanodipatir, Brahma Shivo me, Brahma Shivo me, Astu, Astu, Sa Sadasai, Sadashiv, Astu Sadashivom, Astu Sadashivom. The mistake here. So, we can only say a few things. Very often you can understand better how a person is or how something is by looking into its history, you know. So in this way, Shiva, Vishnu, and forms of the goddess, these are the great gods of Hinduism. And you can think that Hindus do say, you know, I'm a Shaivite, or I'm a Vaishnava, or I'm a Shakta, follow goddess. Nowadays it's become fashionable to say I'm a Hindu, but people would generally anyway continue to distinguish themselves one from another that way. So Shaivites, we're talking about, I don't know, 500, 600, 800 million people. Huh? That's double the population of Europe, no? Or the States. So if you think of Shaivism as a religion, or you think of it as part of Hinduism, it's a huge number of people who believe that God is Shiva. You know, like the Jews, he's Yahweh or Adonai, and Christians, he's Jesus or God the Father, Allah. So for a Shaivite, God is Shiva. So the Lord Shiva that people know, he has quite a lot of stories and myths, and in that way, and as a mythological figure, as a figure of myth, we don't have that so much in Christianity or the Semitic religions, because that could we switch this off and make me ill? And it will make us ill. Hello? You wouldn't think of Yahweh or Allah and so on as a figure of myth, as a personage in mythology. Lord Shiva also, as God, in the full sense of what you would mean by God if you are Semitic, you are Jewish or Muslim or Christian. He has a full theological identity as much as this God, as the West Semitic God. He has a very elaborate, very extensive theology, a study of his divine nature as God with a capital G. And so that at one side, and on the other side, he also appears as a figure within stories and myths. Yeah. And there is a third dimension which don't seem immediately accessible, but is very important, is the manner that he appears within the context of ritual and in the way in which he is worshipped. That is to say, in his mantras and in the rites that are performed, of which he is the supreme deity. And another dimension, which you wouldn't find normally in the West, is this very special feature that he has, but also Vishnu as the great God has that, is that he is an exemplar as a yogi. And he is the goal, what is attained through the practice of yoga, and in those texts called Tantras, Shaiva Tantras, the scripture, part of the scriptures of the Shaivism, a large part is dedicated to ritual, and a large part is dedicated to different kinds of yogas, and a third part is dedicated, smaller but very important, to the nature of the world, cosmology, who Lord Shiva is, the nature of individual soul, what binds the little individual soul, and what's most important, what liberates the individual soul, because the individual soul is liberated, well, in two ways, but in one way most, and that is through ritual action. And the Shaiva scriptures, Shaiva Agama, Shaiva Tantras, describe these procedures, these rites. So a great part, a large part, significant part of who he is as the God of these rituals. And he is also the God of the myths, and he is the God who is the creator, sustainer, withdrawer of the world, who is transcendent, infinite consciousness, and at the same time present in the world. And each individual soul, he may be an identity with him, or is a spark of his own consciousness. So all of these aspects, 3 or 4, the theological, the liturgical, the mythological, and the yogic, they all have their history. One could deal with them one at a time, with the history of the mythology of Shiva, the history of the theology of Shiva, the history of the yogic practices that are taught in the Shaiva Tantras of Shiva, and the history of the liturgies associated with the god Shiva. Okay? Then, of course, there's one other big dimension, and that is the sociology of this god, how this god appears in our human everyday world, the temples to him, the small shrines, and that takes us into the whole world of iconography and art history and so on. So, of course, I can't possibly say anything more than skip us a little bit, a taste from each one of those dishes. No? I think we can answer one question. We can look for an answer to one question. In India, you will all know that there are many gods. The saying is, when they asked in the Upanishads, and this you get on all the documentaries on Hinduism, you know, some nice Indian man will be telling you that there were 33 gods. They asked Yajnavalkya, he said there are 33. Then he said, no, there are 330,000 or 333 million, and so on and so on. And then the end of the thing is the cliche remark that there are as many gods as there are people in India or maybe the world, right? Well, that's rather interesting, and because amongst them, like amongst people, there are single individuals that you see all the time in the newspaper or on the net, right? And there are billions and billions of others that you never see at all, or that you will just because they're your neighbors or you happen to meet them, right? So out of these millions and millions of gods, why has this one become so great? Why has this one become so great? There's another one that become very great, is Vishnu. No? And the third one is the goddess. First Durga, and then a number of goddesses. She has a more varied identity. Right. Now, one of the reasons, a very important reason, first we begin with this. The Rig Veda, this is the oldest religious work in India, is a collection of hymns to the Vedic gods. Of these, the greatest Vedic god is Indra, and the second one is the god of fire, Agni. He's the priest. Now, in that way, they are graded according to the number of hymns or mentions, like these, you know, academia, these are, yeah. So in the Rig Veda, which is the oldest part of the Veda, in the oldest part of the Rig Veda, he appears once. He doesn't even have a hymn to himself. No? So why does this very minor Vedic god become one of the great gods of modern Hinduism? Okay? And there are a number of very interesting factors. What reason in the word, just to, so you're going to follow me more easily, I give you the answer at the back of the book. And the reason is because when the Vedic religion gradually developed and moved out of being Vedic into classical Hinduism, and the forms that it took, but then after that into Tantric Hinduism and the forms that it took, then Shiva was a god whose nature and characteristics, his theology, his mythology, his iconography, and other things which I'll now describe, was very suited to make this adaptation. What was most suitable? Well, first of all, the change in character in the gods. The Vedic gods, the Germans had a big fixation about this. They were not wrong, because traditional Indian interpretation always was that these great Vedic gods are natural phenomena. There's Vayu, the wind, Agni is fire, Dyaus, sky, and the earth, and there's the dawn, and the sun, and 12 kinds, so many kinds of sun, natural phenomena. Thunder, the howling winds, the maruts, etc. Okay? That means that they are disembodied. They're not anthropomorphic. Although you would say, that Agni has a red beard, he likes to eat wood and other things, the fire, okay? But they're not fully anthropomorphic. You can perceive some sense of their anthropomorphism, an emergent anthropomorphism. So now what is with what happened with, he wasn't called Shiva then, he was called Rudra. Now one hymn to Rudra, the one connection, very strong connection, which is a real one, not one that's made by politics or propaganda, with Vedic religion, which is quite different from classical Hinduism. There are no temples to Indra, no temples to Vayu, no temples to Varuna, to Mitra, a host of these Vedic gods. I went once to a Vedic school in South India, and I said, where do you tell these kids to go if they want to go to a temple, to one of these gods? There are none. Okay? Now, this is rather controversial, what I've just said. There is perfect continuity, but there has also been significant change. And one of these has been, very important one, is that the gods have taken on a strongly human anthropomorphic form. Now, the worship of Shiva still takes place on a common basis with the use of certain Vedic mantras. Having told you that he appears just once in the oldest part of Rig Veda, well, he gets a little more popular as you go along. And by the time you get to the Taittiriya and the Aranyaka, which says is some centuries from the earliest Rig Veda, he has become, there's a beautiful hymn addressed to him, which is called the Hymn to the 100 Rudras. And that is still very commonly recited. Very, very commonly recited. And a number of mantras developed from that hymn, of which these 5 that we recited today. Now, in the hymns to the 100 Rudras, they are addressed not to one Shiva, to one Rudra, but to 100 of them. And at the same time to a single one. Don't shoot me, he's got a bow and an arrow. He's a hunter, he's got tiger skin, and you ask him, please, don't fire your arrows in my direction. Right? Don't come after me. Don't bring the plague. Keep our animals healthy, right? Protect us. Don't be angry with us. Keep your quiver empty and your bow unstrung. Okay? And then he's addressed as being the loved by potters, carpenters, thieves, people who move in the night, chariot makers, carpenters, such kind of people. It's a list of the members of Vedic society, right? That are developed by that time. Now he said it to be 100. Why? Because he is in 10 places at once, in the 10 directions, at 4 cardinal points, 4 intermediate points, above and below. And he is also, in each one of those, he radiates in 10 more directions, which gives you an idea. In Sanskrit, if you say shata, means 100, can mean like innumerable. So he goes on going 10 by 10 by 10. He proliferates exponentially, okay? He's a bit like those YouTube programs on what is infinity, and imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. Would there always be an empty room for somebody, another person? Okay. So he replicates. Now, this is a property which becomes fundamental, one of the fundamental properties of the gods who became the great gods of Hinduism. And their capacity for replication. The Semitic god, there is one that replicates like that. But the other people don't agree with him. But that's very contained because it's a solitary case, unique case. And the whole theology has to be built upon him for that replication to be accounted for, right? How the one God remains one, though he's also become another God, right? So with Rudra, he doesn't just become a second one or a member of a triad or quaternity or something. He replicates ad infinitum in a way. Okay. Now, even amongst the many number of possible forms, as we said, we went back to, in a way, he colonizes all the gods because he can become an infinite number. They can all be him individually. You understand? And that was required for a model of religion that was no longer based on deities that are in the atmosphere or in the landscapes of rivers or such, but there are deities that are in different places. There are hundreds of them, there are thousands of them. They live here, they live there. No? So it is that the God's deity has come down, as it were, to earth. And but for that deity to maintain its divine status, no? Now, the same him that I was telling you about, that he becomes 100 forms, not only is a model of a kind of new property of a deity, who's kind of embodied iconically, and has his body, as it were, has these kind of properties. I won't say like a cartoon character. We would if we were in Harvard or something, because that's a very snappy thing. In America, they like all that. But he has a kind of plasticity, which is very essential. And what does that mean concretely? Well, the hymn itself is also one of the earliest examples of a very common kind of eulogy, and is the 100 names, or the 1,000 names, in which a deity is addressed, and he is called this, he's called that, Rudraya, Shivaya, Ishanaya, Sada Shivaya, Charukeshaya, like this it goes on, and 100 names, 108 names, 1,000 names, right? The idea behind those names is that it's one God with many forms. Here, each one of us in this room, we all have different names, but one self. This doesn't occur to people who are doing the reciting in this way, right? Okay? Now, understand that this is a very major property. The gods are no longer being brought down. They live in the 23 constellations, and they have a nice meal is being cooked for them. They're being invoked, come down, have your grub, and then they leave, right? So they don't need to have, pluriform bodies, iconic forms, etc., etc. Or even a plurality of identities. Now here is Rudra, who's not only have 100 forms, is present everywhere, but 100 names, 1,000 names. Now, what does that mean? You see, it means that you have the mantras that we recited at the beginning. They're called the 5 Brahmas. They are all mantras dedicated to Rudra Shiva. One is Sadyojata, who's been immediately born, spontaneously created. Vamadeva, the beautiful God, or the God who emits all things, Vamadeva. Aghora, who is not fierce, who's beneficial, who's tranquil. And Ishana Tatpurusha means that person, that man, That is to say that the God who is in everyone. And Ishana means Lord or Master of all knowledge, and Lord or Master of all creatures. Right? The same, one Rudra with these 5 names. And then within that, when you begin to say about him, you know, he's Shreshtaya Nama, Rudraya Nama, Jeshtaya Nama, or salutations to Shrestha, the one who's the most excellent of all. Salutations to Jeshta, the one who's the most ancient of all. Salutations to Rudra, to the fierce one. Salutations to Bala, Balaya Nama. Salutations to he who is strength. No, Kalaya Nama, he who is time. Salutations to Kala Vikaranaya, the one who, the transformation of time, what time transforms, and so on. Each one of those is fully and totally Rudra. And at the same time, without contradiction, they are an attendant of Rudra. It's never just a name. This is not a kind of Western democracy where you're on the electoral register and you're just a name. Okay? Right, that's one thing. Next point to notice. One of the features of Lord Shiva is his ascetic character. He is like first of all, an ascetic. What does that mean in India? It means a fellow who is not eating much, and he is bearing the opposites, which you have to do if you're not an ascetic anyway. It gets very hot here, it gets very cold, especially if you're walking around naked, as he would be doing, or just with very practically nothing. No? He is doing penance. The ascetic is doing penance. We can understand that also in the Semitic context. Now, the penance that he performs in the Vedic world was that for some time the Vedic religion was for householders. You kept the Vedic fire in your home, it was the family hearth. You took the fire from there for cooking. And you kept the fire for which you would make daily offerings, because he's your household deity, the fire. I mean, of course, fire saved us, humanity, from terrible cold and fire. Then so the Vedic religion was for householders, people who had families, or who were about to have families, or who, if they didn't have families, they live a life of study, but remaining always within the enclosure, as it were, of the village or the settlement. But there were provisions that emerged for a period for taking vows. You would take a vow. That's another aspect of ascetic life. He's a penitent and he is observant of a vow. Like that Peter of Alcantara, who said that he would never lie down to sleep, or he would never look another person in the face, and he covered his eyes, and from the age of 18 he never looked at anybody else. Or the other ascetic now in India, who said, like Parvati, she performed a lot of austerities to attract Lord Shiva. She put her hand up in the air, she stood on one leg, she didn't eat, and so on. She performed austerities. For what? To purify herself, to make herself appear and to be holy and saintly before that divine being of whom she wanted to be the wife. Okay? So they grew up, it became all right, normal, for a Vedic householder to take a period off to go into the forest. They had these little small settlements along rivers. It's completely surrounded by dense forest. And not only, but that was a major feature. So you would have the village and the forest, Gramya and Aranya. And there was a kind of big polarity there, you know, domestic and wild and so on, right? So if you left the village to enter the forest, you were then on your own, right? In a very deep sense. And you are also, again, part of nature in a very deep sense. And so, who was the god who was the most like that? Well, Rudra. He lives in the forest. He's a hunter. Okay? He's a wild god because he's in the wilderness of the forest, the wide open spaces. He is a god who exemplifies a life of adherence to fundamental nature with a double sense of personal and this physical nature. Okay? Now, this connects us. Now we begin to enter slowly into history. That is to say, recordable events that could be to some degree dated. We hear in the commentary in Panini. In Panini is a grammarian. And there's a word, Shaiva Bhagavata, that is declined in a slightly irregular manner. So he mentions that word to indicate that there is some difference in its declination from some other words that are similar to that. And the commentator, Patanjali, in his commentary, he says Shaiva Bhagavatas are those characters who walk around naked carrying an iron lance. Right? So he's 3rd century BC. So we know that in 3rd century BC, Shaiva Bhagavata means devotee of Shiva. There were people who considered themselves to be devotees of Shiva, who walked around naked, like ascetics, like the sadhus we see nowadays, and they carried lances. And we know that in later times, they may be carrying tridents. Right? Now, now we have to leap forward. There's a lot of gaps in the history and the actual data that we have. But another very major milestone, datable one, is some centuries later, but nicely connected to that, is the very famous Mathura pillar inscription. Mathura is a place near Agra, where the Taj Mahal is. And it talks about a fellow called Lakulisha, and it names 3 of his disciples in order of generation. So there are 4 generations till you get to this man who made the inscription, who belonged to 4th century AD. So this fellow Lakulisha lived in 2nd century AD, because it's 4 generations like that, okay? Now this man, we are told in the inscription, is a Pashupata. Now Pashupata means a follower of a god, Rudra, yes, you guessed, who's called Pashupati, lord of the creatures. Pashu means animal or creature, especially the sense of sacrificial animal. But it also came to mean, in later theology, or even in the theology of the people who some works that have remained of these Pashupatas, it also denotes the individual soul, who is fettered, who is bound, tethered, like a sacrificial animal. Pashu from Pasha, which means tether or rope. And a Pashu is someone who is tied by such a rope, a Pasha. Okay? And he is Pati, he is lord of them. Right? Now these people, we know from a Pashupati Sutra. A Pashupati Sutra was commented on by a man we know, lived in 5th century AD, who was called Kaundinya. He was a Brahmin. And the sutras may have been 1 or 2 centuries before, but reflecting certainly the kind of things that Lakulisha would be teaching his followers. And he became a very important, iconic figure. You find him all over the place on Orison temples. Lakulisha, okay? With his club, and he's sitting and so on. Now, we can't go into too many details, but what is important about them is that what they did was that they repeated 5 mantras, which were the 5 that we recited at the beginning of this session. And they were called, they came to be called the 5 Brahmas, the 5 creators. Because a lot of symbolism, energy, power, and so on, was invested in understanding what these mantras were over the centuries. No? Okay, now these 5 mantras are Vedic mantras. And that means that these Pashupatas, who are uttering Vedic mantras, in order to be traditionally entitled to that, they would have to be Brahmins. Means the 4% of the population that is Brahmin. Okay? And indeed we know that from Kaundinya, he was a Brahmin, and he very much sponsored Pashupata Brahmins, or Brahmin Pashupatas. But we also know that there were a lot of Bodhs who were also moving that way, and were not. Right? Now, we're moving along. Now, just for a moment, we got up to about 5th century AD. Okay? We are on the verge, we are just on the edge. We're at the lineal, we become liminal now. We're tingling with the energy of transition into the great Shaiva age. This is what your friend Sanderson, the beginnings of that, and that is the revelation of scriptures that were called Agama, Samhita, Tantras, and so on. The first of which was centered around the figure of Rudra, like the Vedic Rudra, who became, Rudra means fierce, and Shiva means peaceful, tranquil. Shiva was one of Rudra's names and one of his identities, and it became prominent amongst one group. Okay. Now, that's one thing that's going on. And another thing that's going on is the development of the mythology of Shiva. That's going on, carrying in a parallel stream. In those texts we call the Tantras, the scriptures we call the Tantras, that developed from about 6th century AD onwards, there's very little myth. There is some, and it's significant when it appears, but there's very, very little myth. The content is, first of all, ritual, second, yogic practices, and third, there may be some theology. Okay? They may be considerable, it varies. No myth. Very little myth. Unless you think of cosmology as mythological. Right? So the myths of Lord Shiva were growing up in another literature, which was not tantric, but was considered to be more connected to the Veda, as something which was Vedic, sort of half-remembered. They're called Smriti, half-remembered. It's as if to say, this is still Vedic, but it's not the same. It's sort of half-remembered. That there's a continuity, and that we want to keep that continuity, and that it's meant for a society of people who would have perhaps at another time have been votaries of Veda, and who continue to support it, and who consider that the Veda is supreme authority. So they don't appear as a new set of scripture. They appear as a reflection, centuries ahead, of the original scriptures which are the Veda. Okay? The Tantras, oh yes, they appear as a distinctly different set of scripture. This is another revelation. Now, I don't want to become controversial about that, but this is the feature. So, in what was recollected is the world, is the dimension within which the mythologies of Shiva are enacted. And just 2 or 3 things need to be said about that, because that connects the theological identity, which we'll discuss in a moment. It connects the liturgy, in all those aspects that we mentioned, enumerated at the beginning. No? The mythology of Shiva, like the great mythologies in the Puranas, the main big ones, have roots in Vedic mythology. One of the main features of Lord Shiva in the late Vedic mythology in which he appears is that he observes a moment of primordial incest. He precipitates creation by interrupting the union of a father with his daughter. The god Brahma, Prajapati, he is enamored with his daughter, who is speech. He is the Veda and she is speech. Okay? And he is infatuated and he falls in love with her, whatever you like. It's extremely improper, of course. And he then runs after her. She runs away. She becomes this animal, that animal, a female. He becomes the equivalent male, till finally he catches up with her when she's just become a mare, and he assumes the form of a stallion. They're just about to unite. Rudra sees the sin of the father, and he shoots his arrow and castrates him. And the whole thing, the genitals fall on the ground. They create a great pool, a great lake, and from that great lake, the creatures are born. They come out on land, and so on. Okay? Now, I don't want to go into this. People have done PhDs and books, and I mean, primordial incest is very fascinating, especially after Freud and all that. That's not the point. Now, the thing is that Shiva himself, in the later mythology, Shiva appears as an ascetic. He lives in a cave. He's immersed in meditation. He goes into higher states of consciousness, and the descriptions of those actually lay out paths of what happens when you enter into higher states of consciousness, step by step, to the practice of yoga. This is one thing about them. But at the same time, he's extremely attractive. Wow, he's very good looking, right? I mean, that's not his fault. It's the quality. It's rather different from being Krishna, who's attractive, because he's not going around saying, I'm a yogi, understand, right? But the kind of attraction that Lord Shiva has, is symbolic of his greatly ambiguous, ambivalent nature. And people have written about that, and one very nice book called Shiva, the Erotic Ascetic, came out by Wendy Doniger-O'Flaherty, and is extremely readable and wows you at every page, but it's probably very tiring because it's so dense and so full of information and facts, and each so many are so extraordinary that most minds would require, 1 or 2 hours rest after each page. It's a bit like looking at a great work of art, Most people can't, most of us, can't manage more than a glance, in a gallery, whereas, a great work of art would require living in front of it and being with it, which we can't do in a gallery mostly. They will throw you out at closing time. Okay? So here we have, now of course, what's the connection with the people we told before? Well, he's a Pashupata. He isn't a Pashupata, but he's the model for the ascetic. But now he's also a yogi. Those Pashupatas, there was no talk of yoga. Right? Yes, there's a history, you know. Some yoga, Patanjali Yoga Sutra may have existed, 2nd century, 3rd century BC, but unlikely. Why? Well, because you would expect Pashupatas to be yogis, which they are not. They are ascetics. Now, what's the difference? Well, they're very similar. And they practice, what they practice is very important. What Lord Shiva practices is very important. They worship lingams, which is a very common thing, stone lingams. They spread Shaivism all over India because they're wandering. They find a stone, they said, oh, this is Lord Shiva and his lingam, and start worshipping it by repeating these 5 mantras that we just mentioned. Okay? Now, in the myth, Shiva, you see, as Rudra, he castrated his father. Right? Bad karma. And he has a lot of, that bad karma makes a lot of interesting developments in his spiritual side. Now, there was one repercussion, was that there were the 7 rishis. There's 7 rishis, you know? And they lived nice idyllic lives on a river somewhere, in a jungle, and they each got wives, right? And in the morning they would go off for their, ablutions. Nice little bath, and left the wives alone. And then, of course, Lord Shiva comes along, and they're completely wowed by him, which they shouldn't be, no? And they think, wow, I mean, he's irresistible, right? And, he's tried to, be casual about it. But in the end, he gives in a bit for them, a bit for himself, no? And he makes love to all 7 of them, because he can replicate, as I said before. So when the rishis come back, immediately they feel, hello, there's something different. Usually my wife is, not so perky. Huh? So then they think something happened, and with their own intuitive sense, then they saw that what had happened. So then they called on him, they cursed him. They said, you are a great God Shiva, and you do this thing to us. And he was very upset himself. He was so angry, he took his phallus, ripped it off himself, and threw it on the ground. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew, and it became so powerful. And then boom, 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 up to one world after another, layer after layer, it became immense. Galactic clusters, size. And hugely powerful, immense, much more than anything you've seen on YouTube. So then the gods are freaking out because the whole cosmic order is being disrupted. And so they say, what are we going to do? Well, they gather all their energies together. Shakti appears, and she says, come on, I can take it. And he plops into her yoni. And that explains why Shiva lingams are like this. Right? Now, that is a story that is told in the Puranas. I don't want to make comments. I did tell this story to a group once, when we were in one of these akharas with the sadhus, well, some 20 years ago. And the fellow, there was a priest there, he looked at me, he says in Hindi, says, why are you telling them this? It's not that he's saying or telling them something wrong, it's incorrect, but why tell them such a thing? Right? Now the reason why I'm telling you such a thing is because it accounts for the Shiva lingam, which is ubiquitous, right? And it accounts for the kind of ambiguous nature of his asceticism. And there it accounts for why he became a yogi. And when the yogi was meant to be a person like that. All right? So now we conclude very briefly. These Pashupatas were of 2 kinds. one Brahminical. One thing all these Pashupatas had in common was that they had to give up the notion of pure and impure. Now that doesn't mean the notion of moral and immoral. That's quite a different idea. They don't have to say give up the idea of what's moral and immoral. That's very different. Almost nothing to do with that, except in the general sense that if you eat impure things, that's immoral if you're Hindu. If you give up the notion of pure and impure, like Christians have done. They eat pork. No one thinks, there's something wrong with that. Although the Muslims and the Jews, think, this is a real dirty bunch. They don't tell you that to their face. Sometimes they do. Okay? See? So for such a thing, if you're Indian, Hindu, to say that I don't care about what I eat and goes into my mouth or all of that is a huge kind of renunciation of standard norms. Because what the Pashupata is looking for is to be like Lord Shiva, that is transcendent of restrictions. That doesn't mean immoral. Transcendent of restrictions means transcendent of being conditioning by contingent limitations. That means secondary, not intrinsic. If you get a crystal, you put a red flower behind it, it goes red. That doesn't color the crystal. That's an extraneous adjunct. That's not intrinsic, as it would be if the crystal was red colored. Okay? So they believe that what is binding a person, they considered that human life, we human beings, are suffering. They're a bit like Buddhists in that respect. And the end of suffering comes by entering into a world called the pole star, which was the pole star, was fixed. And you rise to that by becoming free of all things that are sullying the soul. I want to make one last basic point here. Now, as I said, all of these Pashupatas have a sense or rule that you should not keep these rules of purity. You shouldn't have caste, although they were all Brahmins. And they did distinguish themselves by Brahmin and non-Brahmin. Okay? So you know how it is with caste. It sticks to you like anything, right? Huh? But these were the ideals. And they would exercise themselves in that, not by just saying, okay, I'll just dig into a nice leg of man, or something. I'll also provoke people to speak badly of me. I'll also provoke people to do things that to an ordinary person would be disturbing, but which will not disturb me because my mind is centered on Lord Shiva, right? And then my concern is not to get money, to become wealthy, to have social status, not at all to have social status, right? Someone like me, you got a chair, I'll always say, I prefer to stand. No, I have done that more than once, because I'm just built like that. I'm not liked for that reason sometimes, and perhaps part of me is also detests that other part of me, who knows? So there is a sense, some people are like this. They feel it's been a huge subject of modern art, and the 19th century, and the Romantics, and Baudelaire, and you name it, Bataille, Georges Bataille. If you were French, you'd all be going, wow, existentialism, and, and then all the flower power, and rules and regulations, and all that stuff, right? And some of them have also led to terrible extremes. I don't know, Aleister Crowley was that terrible. He couldn't get beyond the 13th level initiation. Mind you, still Poor fellow. Yeah, but, okay. Now understand, so. But there were these two possibilities that developed. One was to remain a Shaivite, and that means transgressive to a degree, but not lose your moorings as a Vedika. Okay? Say you were performing the vow before, you would go back to Vedic society, and then you would go back to all the rules and regulations about pure and impure and all the rest of it, right? And another way was all out. So you found inscriptions and references in texts of a kind of Pashupata who didn't only walk around naked and had matted hair or shaven head, and as an ascetic would in India, but this fellow, he wore garlands of bones, human bones. He carried a skull. Now, explain why he did that? Well, we go back to the mythology of Shiva. Now, we talked about his emasculation. Now, in the same cycle of myths, the teaching punishment of Brahman, of Brahma, the creator, in one of those stories, Brahma has 5 heads because he sees in all directions. His daughter, who is Saraswati and the embodiment of speech, is walking around him reverentially, and as she goes by, she sees the eyes going around, looking at her, and women, they tell me, they sense, when they're being looked at in a way that they find unpleasant. So she was feeling more and more nervous. She finished the round, and then she flew up into the air as quick as she could, and then the upper head looked up, and Indian ladies don't wear underwear. Okay. So, so Rudra was there, and he was incensed, and he just cut his head off, the upper head. So poor Brahma now only has 4 instead of 5. Okay? Now that was tantamount to killing a Brahmin. Right. Now if you kill a Brahmin, then you must perform a kind of atonement for that. Penance. So we go back to the whole model, penance, asceticism, etc., right? And the performance of a vow. Okay? So that vow is called the vow of the skull. Because you would carry the skull of that Brahmin you killed, and you would collect alms in it, you would eat your food in it, which would be most unclean. And you would be seen by people in society that you were doing that, and you would also have the society would also punish you with the reprobate, as a reprobate. They would have this very low opinion of you. Okay? Yeah. Now, in the myth of Lord Shiva, he's wandering around with the skull. He's behaving like one of those, you might say, left-hand Pashupatas. The ones who've gone all the way. Right? When he gets to Benares, now I've just got to Benares, we're almost finished, I'm tired as well. He finally drops the skull in a place called Kapala Mochana, where the skull is dropped. There's a big artificial tank there, and there was once a very big temple to Kal Bhairav as a form of Shiva, okay, to Bhairava. Because as he carries the skull, he's black and furious. And from being Shiva, which means auspicious, white, clean, auspicious, he becomes Bhairava, which means fierce, ferocious. Okay? So as Bhairava, he carries the skull. So you could be a Pashupata imitating that. So when the Tantras came up, and we end with them, you had 2 big kinds from the earliest times. One, which you had a Shiva who was always Shiva, Sada Shiva. It wasn't enough to call him Shiva. You wanted to have him always Shiva. He's not going to relapse into being a Bhairava or anything like that. Right? Okay? And then you had the other ones that were called Bhairava Tantras. Right? Now in the Bhairava Tantras, the difference was the ones with Sadashiva were very male-oriented. Very few females. Cherchez la femme. One good old gave some lectures in the Sorbonne about the feminine in those kind of Shaiva Tantras, more dualistic, clean Shiva, had more sense of pure and impure, supported caste system a little from the outside, those kind of things, who are more in line with Vedic norms in what is here, and the very little of the feminine. So he gave a series of lectures called Cherchez la femme in the Shaiva Agama. This Shaiva Agama. And quite the opposite in the Bhairava Tantras. In the Bhairava Tantras, there is an immense proliferation of the feminine. And we go back to where I began. Rudra, who proliferates into hundreds times hundreds and hundreds of forms. So now who is doing that? More than anybody else? The goddess. Right? Why? Because just before the 5th, 6th century, when the Tantras first began, a concept emerged, or finally crystallized, after more than a millennium, encapsulated in one word. And that was astonishingly novel. The word Shakti. Right? You couldn't have Tantras without Shakti. And you couldn't have Tantras without Shiva. No? So in the Bhairava Tantras, where you don't need to chercher la femme, you're more often looking for chercher l'homme, because they're overwhelming number of female forms, and the kind of sadhanas are done in cremation grounds. You are making offerings to female deities who like to have bodily substances. Okay? Urine, feces, blood, menstrual blood, and sperm, all lovely things. And and usually that's done with substitutes. Let's not get carried away. But it had an ethos of kind of immediate lightning realization. Instead of going on the gradual path, I worship Sadashiva, I got my initiation, every day I do my worship, I take care, I keep in all the rules. If I break any, I do rites of atonement, regular periods through the year, I preserve my priestine status that I was given when I was initiated, and then when I die, I pass over into a state of being Shiva. And these other characters, instead they believed in the possibility of being liberated in this life. And how was that done? By break on through to the other side, right? Through what they call processes of avesha. Avesha is a word that can mean just possession, because you are penetrated to the point of losing your personality, your individuality, by very, very powerful female beings, right? And in that condition, it wipes you out in all senses. And in your absence, then everything that is associated with any impurity, contingency, finitude is wiped out with you, and you enter into emptiness of pure consciousness. And when you emerge from that, your body is so transformed that it's being operated by an infinite light that's shining through these cavities and is burning out the universe, configuring, is burning out at each moment of perception, in that you are fully present to the now and completely master or sense of everything that is taking place is emerging from my infinite being. It is existing within my infinite being. It is dissolving within my infinite being. Right? And that all takes place, whether it's the gradual path or the immediate path, the path of purification or the path of possession and empowerment is always taking place through grace. Grace. So we don't lose sight of this, because in real life, both of these ways are actually ways of devotion. This is the daily bread of a Shaivite's life, and of a worshipper of the mother is his or her attention to deity as infinite being, as Lord God, protector and mother of the universe, who shines within me and within all things, and giver of life, giver of freedom, and the goal of life and of all creation. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Could I have a glass of water?
No.
No. Okay.
That was magnificent. Thank you.
I'm sorry it's take a while. I tried to cover important points now.
Itself a Purana. It was a proliferation of excitement. Is this a music?
Someone's getting it. It's coming.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So did the conventional path, so to speak, did that have an idea of liberation in one life? Or was
Sorry?
Did you said that they'd broken into these two paths, one pure and impure conventional, the other the wildness of the Pashupati path.
Bhairava, yeah.
Bhairava Tantra. Did the conventional have a sense that you could achieve liberation in one life if you
No. No.
It was just
It was always liberation after the collapse of the body.
Yeah. Whereas the Bhairava is in the body, you could live out the living in the body.
Yeah, I mean, but that's all right.
Yeah, that would be great.
Christians also don't believe in liberation in this life, nor the Muslims or the Jews. And it supports quite, viable religions. Huh?
Some Christian mystics believe in being transfigured in this lifetime.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Even Teresa of Avila, who entered into a state of permanent presence of God at the age of 28 after 7 years, of huge torments and visions and that, said that she took care to never lose that presence. Because there was a sense that still within this world there is a possibility of losing that presence, which she never did.
Right. That's true.
Just to, it doesn't matter. So that's all. He's, of course, the images are so startling, and the details can be very perplexing. So you have all kinds of interpretations and explanations within the same tradition, and so different branches of Shaivism also develop in that way, like that. So this is a Puranic city, and the main emphasis is that it's Lord Shiva's city, although Vishnu also had quite a presence, and one way you see him is in Ram and Hanuman, who is Hanuman is in a lot of places, but that's relatively recent, 14th, 15th century, and still the base, you might say, of this city is Shiva's presence.
And you have both sides being acted out in this city. You have both sides being acted out in this city, don't you? You have the Orthodox side with its rules and regulations and purities, and you have this underbelly in which there is
transcendence of that, yes.
Madness and wildness.
Well, the thing is that without having to go into all kind of strange theologies of transcendence or beyond good and evil or any of that, if you belong to a lower caste, you are less bound by the rules of purity and impurity. If you're a very orthodox Brahmin or you won't even eat onions or garlic. I mean, you try and limit what you eat to very little, no? You can have milk and some vegetables, that's it. Right? And as you go down, then you can eat more and more different things. If you're a sweeper, I mean, if you eat a chicken or lamb, people will not eat beef. There's a kind of red line there. I mean, it's not defiling him because you couldn't get any more defiled anyway, if you're right down there. So even the orthodox way of thinking allows for a lot of margins. But this is why the texts of that Bhairava kind, of the immediate realization and transcendence of pure and impure, do spend a while talking about doubt and inhibition that's holding you back. If a teacher at the moment of initiation, he'll hand the disciple some wine or, a slice of leg of man. We won't quite do that, but a little meat or something. And he sees he's trembling, he's shaking, he can't eat it, then he shouldn't give him initiation.
Right.
Stuff like that, no? And but that would only affect a person of a higher caste. If that fellow was, cleaning toilets and up to his neck, up to here in sewage every day, I mean, you give him a bottle of beer, I mean, it's not going to...
Grateful,
He'd be grateful. He said, oh, that's nice. Is it cold? No? That's all. Or nice, steak. Not a beef steak. He wouldn't eat that, but anything else. They call dog cookers. So like that. But at the same time, the great teachers of this kind of what was interesting, and really we must stop here because it's got very late. I'm sorry I came late. And what was very interesting is that both these traditions, they gave us, the world, very interesting and very rich theologies. Theories, concept of God, concept of man, concept of the world. The great Trinity with a small t or something. Huh? And what was most interesting is that the ones who are on the impure or transcending the purity and impurity, those people developed a kind of vision which was very close to the Upanishads. The Vedic Upanishads, Aham Brahmasmi, I'm the Brahman, Tattvamasi, thou art that, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma, all this is the Brahman. No? And they produced a non-dualist philosophy, a non-dualist view of identity with infinite being. The descendants, the refined essence of those people who worship deity in cremation grounds and who had their food out of human skulls. So you look at the Buddhists also. No? You get the Tibetan Buddhists, that kind of Buddhism, yeah? So like that. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for coming. Talk all night, actually.